And in this game I was playing against international master Andrew Hong. Let me just flip the board here. And yeah, I was actually kind of lucky to bounce back in this game, I would say. So the next, this happened the next morning, and we definitely had a very, very interesting game. I'll say that. Although messy, as you guys will see. Okay, so he plays the semi-slav, which I was expecting. This is kind of his main repertoire these days. And I decided to go for bishop g5. So kind of the old main line, the really sharp stuff, allowing the Botvinnik variation with d takes c4. This one is of course super sharp, and allowing the anti-Moscow gambit with h6, bishop h4, and d takes c4, also a super sharp line. I actually played Andrew just 2 months ago in another GM Norm round robin in Minnesota, and in that game I took a actually much more technical approach. I played knight f3 on move 1, I played e3, c4, and we got a very slow game at first that I ended up winning, actually, because he kind of like sacrificed the pawn in the opening, and objectively it was sound, but then he didn't really follow it up correctly, and I just ended up a pawn up very quickly, and I was able to kind of smoothly convert it. But in this game I decided to go for something sharper. I basically wanted to test him a little bit in these lines, because these lines are super sharp and you really have to know your stuff. Not that I'm such a huge expert. It's been a little while since I looked at these lines, but I was booking up, so I was prepared to play a lot of sharp stuff here. Okay, so he goes g5, bishop g3, b5. This is basically kind of like the starting position of the line, where white is a pawn down, but we have a strong center, and black has kind of both gained space and created weaknesses on both sides of the board. So black's king no longer has a super safe place to go to here, and white has this kind of like long-term compensation. So I've always enjoyed playing these kinds of positions because I like fighting for this kind of initiative, but objectively these lines are really risky for white as well, because if things go wrong, they go really wrong, and black can just be winning out of the opening just by like grabbing another pawn or just getting the pieces out, and yeah, could get really ugly for white as well. Okay, so I went for bishop e2. This is I think the main move, and now bishop g7. So this was already a surprise. The main move here is to go bishop to b7. And usually black puts the knight on d7 and then decides what to do with the bishop. Typically the bishop does eventually go to g7, but from what I remember, the main reason that it's kind of bad for the bishop to go to g7 this early is that white can just immediately go e5 and then play like knight e4 and try to get the knight to d6, which is possible in every line, but it's for this reason that black kind of wants to keep the bishop on f8 here. So I believe the move is actually very playable, but maybe it does have this immediate drawback. Yeah, there was a question about the Moscow variation with bishop takes f6. This is a very serious line. I mean, I think theoretically most of the top players, if they go for bishop g5 and h6 happens on the board, then I think most of them actually will go for bishop takes f6 here. Because it's generally considered to be a safer way for white to fight for the advantage. I haven't looked at these lines too deeply. They're definitely very playable for white, and if you enjoy playing with a space advantage, then I think it's definitely a very reasonable line. But it certainly is less sharp. So in this game I was specifically looking for a sharp position where preparation and plays an important role, and I was kind of hoping to just kind of like out-prepare my opponent and maybe try to catch him in one of these sharp positions where white can get a furious attack right from the opening. So it's really just depends on what kind of position you'd rather play. For this game, I definitely wanted to get more of a fight for the initiative. Maybe it was because I lost the last game and I was looking for a fight. I'm not really sure, because my opponent is actually extremely strong in terms of like calculation. So going for a sharp position against a young kid with like really good calculation, not always the smartest move, but it kind of felt right for this game. Okay, so bishop g7, I push e5, and then he goes knight h5. If knight d5, then white goes knight e4, and I think this is already really annoying for black, because knight comes to d6, king will have to move. If he castles kingside here, then this attack with h4 is just immediately really dangerous for black. Like, for example, g4, we can play like knight h2, and if h5, I think, among other things, there are a lot of ideas simply to sacrifice the bishop on g4, get the knight to g4, try to play like knight f6 check somewhere, or h5, h6, and this kind of attack can just be crushing. So black really has to be very, very careful here before castling kingside so early. Okay, so after knight h5, I was basically out of book. I didn't really know the theory here, which I really should have studied. Oh, there was a question about the Botvinnik variation. Yeah, I think this move, d takes c4, I did prepare this one as well, so I was ready to go here. These positions, yeah, a ton of theory. I don't love playing them for white, but I feel like they're not exactly a picnic for black either, because black has to know a ton of theory themselves, and it's kind of like a minefield for both sides. So sometimes that's what we want with white if we're really trying to play for the win. Okay, so yeah, against knight h5, I was considering a couple of different ideas here. One of the main moves I was looking at was, of course, knight e4, but I honestly just wasn't exactly sure. I definitely didn't know what the theory here is, and so I had a couple of different ideas. But one move that I just couldn't really pull myself away from was this sacrifice idea that comes up a lot, actually, with knight takes g5. And in fact, there's like a famous game between Kramnik and Anand that went this way, with where white played knight takes g5. I wasn't sure if it was exactly in this position or not during the game, but basically white goes knight takes g5. Since the knight on h5 is hanging, black has to go knight takes g3. Then white pops on f7. Queen is hanging, so black has to play king takes f7, and then white goes f takes g3. So essentially sacrificing a piece for 2 pawns, but opening the f-file and getting ready to castle quickly and get the rook in with check. And if I remembered correctly during the game, I was thinking that I remembered that Kramnik had huge attacking chances in this game, and it was a very strong attack. But Anand actually won the game, and this is actually, some of you may have even seen this game if you're familiar with some of the classics, because it features a very, very famous defensive sacrifice that I think was pretty ingenious. So I ended up going for knight takes g5. I didn't really see a reason not to go for it. It looked like it was going to promise at least interesting attacking chances, and this is kind of what I was playing for. So I decided, to just be a man, just like step up and just sacrifice the piece like you're supposed to, and just go for it. Although objectively, I wasn't feeling that confident about the sacrifice, to be honest. I just kind of felt like it was the right thing to do, and I just kind of played it and hoped that it would work out. So afterwards, I looked up the game, and the way the Kramnik Anand game played was a little bit different. So here Anand actually went with bishop b7, which is the main move. Kramnik played e5, knight h5, and then Kramnik threw an a4, kind of forcing a6. And then in this position, he sacked on g5. So it wasn't the same position, but it was pretty similar. Knight g3, knight takes f7, f takes g3, king g8, castles, and basically white had a pretty nasty initiative here, because like the bishop is coming to g4, hitting e6, the knight is coming to e4 and then to d6. I mean, it doesn't look like white is really delivering checkmate, but the point is that black's pieces are going to be dominated, kind of dealing with white's activity here. So the position is very unpleasant for black to play. I think objectively the engine gives equal, but in a practical sense, it's usually easier to play this for white. But yeah, this super famous idea that Anand came up with, if you guys haven't seen it, I'll just go to the critical moment, because it's absolutely incredible. Let's see, bishop g5, queen c2. So the game continued. Kramnik was playing for this attack. Queen e2, bishop a8 takes, rook f8, knight e4. And this was kind of the critical moment. So here white is threatening to take on g5, And the idea is that after rook takes g5, bishop takes e6 check is a huge problem. Queen takes e6, then the rook on g5 is hanging. So Anand goes c5. So just like blasting the pawn out, opening up the bishop. Kramnik takes on g5, so just taking back a clean piece. And then black goes bishop d5. So just completely ignoring that white's last move was knight takes g5, just like a full bishop, and just playing bishop d5, solidifying the e6 pawn, gaining a tempo on the knight because now the knight is under attack and has to move. And after the knight goes back to f3, black plays c takes b4. All of a sudden, black's pawns on the queen side are just monstrous. It's like these pawns are pushing. The bishop on d5 is worth like 5.5 points in this position, and black's rooks are actually super good defenders here, despite the lack of pawns. So basically, like white's attack was completely over, and the position was just completely winning for black. And I think this game became famous because towards the end, there was a bunch of passed pawns in the position. Yeah, there was a bunch of tactics. Okay, it's too complicated to go through. If you guys want, you should just look up on YouTube or chess.com. I'm sure there's a bunch of videos about this game. And yeah, in the final position here, after knight g6, white finally resigned, and there was 7 passed pawns on the board. 5 of which were white's, but unfortunately black's 2 passed pawns ended up being obviously much stronger. So yeah, brilliant game by Anand there, back from 1997. And yeah, this is the game I kind of had in mind. So it didn't end well for white, but the attack was supposedly dangerous. So this is kind of what I was hoping for, or aiming for. Okay, so going back to the game. Oh, there was a question, sorry, I missed, from Pawnspew. What happens after 9 b4? Yeah, this is a line where black just goes b4 and then tries to take the pawn on e4. I think white goes knight a4, knight takes e4, and bishop e5, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, now it's 2 pawns for white, but white does get a lot of compensation here according to the theory. And we are trying to quickly win back the c4 pawn, so we'll at least be getting 1 back. And then, yeah, at some point this knight is going to be attacked and I'll have to move. White can get the c5 square. So white's positional compensation, I think, definitely continues from here. Okay, so yeah, I went for the sack. Knight takes g3, knight takes f7, king takes f7. And now apparently, according to the engine, instead of f takes g3, h takes g3 was also worth considering. Both moves are considered that approximately equal by Stockfish. HG I don't really understand because it doesn't seem like the rook is so useful on the h-file, but it's hard to argue with Stockfish 10 for very long before you end up looking silly, so I don't know. Okay, but I went with FG. This to me looked a lot more natural. And okay, so here I still wasn't sure how much time, or how well my opponent knew this position, because he had already spent a couple minutes on bishop g7, which would indicate that he wasn't really totally sure about what he's doing in this position, but it's not that much time that I thought he was like out of book. And then when I played e5, he played knight h5 relatively quickly. So I'm pretty sure he was familiar with this position, but after knight takes g5, he started taking some time. So my guess was that he was aware of this idea, and after the game I asked him, and he had of course seen the Kramnik Anand game, so he knew about this, but he didn't really think it was that good for white in this position. But then once we get here, after f takes g3, he spent a ton of time here. He spent like 54 minutes, which was quite a lot in this position on to play the next move. I think he had like an hour and 20 minutes or something at this point, an hour and 25. And then after his move king to e7, he was down to like 30 minutes. To play 27 more moves before the time control. It's like 40 moves in 100 minutes, and then you get another 30 minutes. So this is move 13. We have 27 moves to get to move 40. And he has 30 minutes to make 27 moves. So he gets 30 seconds per move, which basically means he has approximately 90 seconds per move from here on out, which is just really hard to do in like such a complicated position. I mean, he's very good at calculation, but to me it seemed like a huge mistake to spend so much time. I mean, king e7 is probably not the best move in the position, but despite that, I mean, it's a difficult position to play. You're not going to be able to find the best move, but at some point you should just choose something and then just go with it. I think the best move was rook f8, just to try to castle by hand, and I'm sure he was considering this for a while. But once you start analyzing, it does feel like black has some concrete problems here, like king to g8, rook takes f8 check, queen takes f8, and I think I was going to do something like queen c2 here. And my idea is to just quickly go rook to f1, bishop h5, knight e4, knight d6, rook f7, queen g6, and checkmate, some checkmate. I mean, objectively, white shouldn't be getting all this. Black can defend, but it does look scary. And what my opponent was doing was he was trying to really just like calculate this out, like move by move. Like black goes knight d7, white goes rook f1, queen e7, bishop h5, and like, is black going to be in time here to defend? And he just couldn't figure it out, and it just looked too scary for him. Objectively, I think black is doing okay here, and maybe I would assume black is just better with best play, because if you don't get enough for the piece, you don't get enough for the piece, and so you're just down. And keep in mind, by the way, I sacrificed a pawn in the opening, so when I got 2 pawns for the piece, I only ended up with 1 pawn for the piece, because I was already down a pawn originally. So I only have 1 pawn for the piece here. So if the attack fizzles out, I'm just dead lost. What do you do when your opponent spends so long on a move? Well, honestly, you walk around, you let them take their time. I found that once someone goes into the tank, if you're sitting at the board with them, I think they're more likely to make a move, because there's like this social pressure of like, you know, there's someone in front of you and they're waiting for you to make a move, so hurry up. But when you leave them alone, players are more likely to take more of a tank kind of think, and just, they really, you know, dig into the position. They don't like anything they see. They end up revisiting a lot of lines, and it usually doesn't improve the play, which I think is the biggest thing here. It's like, it's not like you spend 54 minutes, you're guaranteed to find the best move, because king e7 wasn't the best move in the position. So usually it's not even helpful to spend that much time. Okay, so here I spent a little bit of time. I knew what move I wanted to play almost immediately, but I thought it would be rude to just blitz out bishop h5 here after after he had spent like 54 minutes. So I spent a couple minutes, like, out of respect, and also, okay, to like double check lines, and because I was thinking about the position as well, and I was already thinking about what I was gonna do against various moves. But my idea with bishop h5 is to basically set up queen g4, which is a very annoying move, and then castle and try to play rook f7. So I actually felt like this is already looking very dangerous for black. He goes king d7. If he goes rook to f8, which I thought was also natural to cut my king, then I play queen g4, let's say bishop h8, and I believe I was just going to castle queenside here and just play this position. And this looked like fun. I mean, the king on e7 is not going to be safe here. And I have all kinds of d5 breakthroughs and so on, potentially. But yeah, objectively, I think the engine doesn't like it. It prefers queen e4, and then white has decent attacking chances as well. So he goes king d7. I think this makes sense. He was just trying to shuffle his king over to the queen side here. I castled rook to f8 and knight e4. I think this actually wasn't best. I think I had this idea to play queen g4, forcing queen to g5, and then I don't want to trade queens here, so I go queen e2 back. And the point is I cover queen e3 check, and I'm also preparing knight to e4, where his queen is gonna have to go backwards. And the problem for black here is just like the rooks aren't connected. So if he ever trades rooks in this position, my rook is gonna show up on f7, and this is just gonna be extremely problematic. I mean, in many cases the bishop is just getting caught. So yeah, overall the position is not that easy for black to play here. But okay, I decided to play knight e4. I think this was not the best move, because queen g4, queen e2 just makes more sense, because then if queen g5, then I get the tempo back with knight e4, and my queen is improved on e2. But okay, he goes king c7. I played queen d2 here, threatening to go queen a5 check, king to b7, and knight c5 mate, which is a huge threat. So he played a5, which I was kind of expecting. I thought maybe knight d7 was also worth considering here, because if queen a5 check, he can just block with the knight. And I would have likely continued as I did in the game with b3, which is kind of a typical move in this position, just trying to open lines, open the c-file. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, honestly, I didn't really believe in my position at this point. I thought black is probably just better here, but it is annoying to play this with black, because your pieces are undeveloped. If you miss a tactic, the game could just immediately be over. And white is always trying to just open lines, and white is kind of having all the fun. Not to mention the time situation is of course going to be getting dramatic soon, because my opponent was not really speeding up. He was still spending a couple minutes per move here, and really running low very quickly. So a5. Here I decided to play b3. And this is a reasonable idea. So it's pretty thematic. Objectively, it's not such a great move here, because concretely black has a couple of nice responses that he can do against this. But the move makes sense. I'm just trying to open lines here. Like if c takes b3, a takes b3, then the a5 pawn is hanging, and I want to play rook fc1 and just line up against the king, pull my bishop back with bishop f3. Black still can't really take on f1, because after rook takes f1, rook f7 is again just a very, very annoying threat to deal with. I think there's something about this in terms of when we're trying to determine how easy a position is to play, is just like whenever there's tension in the position, like black, for example, can trade rooks on any move in this game, right? But it's always bad to trade rooks. So whenever this kind of tension that the opponent can't resolve, I think it's always a very uncomfortable situation, because they're constantly thinking on every move, oh, should I play rook takes f1 here? Should I play rook takes f1 here? What happens if white goes rook takes f8? Am I covered against this, or is rook takes f8 followed by rook f1 a problem? So basically you have to calculate these lines with black and double check them every move, which obviously drains time and energy. And then it's no surprise that players end up blundering later on, because they kind of spent all their time and energy working out these lines on every detail. But yeah, objectively b3 is probably not a good move. It turns out what black could have done here is actually take on e5, which I didn't really, I saw this was possible, but I didn't really think this was going to be good for black. But after de, queen takes d2, or let's say rook takes f1 check first, rook takes f1, queen takes d2, knight takes d2. Essentially black is given back a piece, but gets this super strong pawn on c3. So after knight a4, b4, the pawn is like a protected passer. I considered this during the game. I didn't think it would be that bad for white, but it turns out that black is just winning here, if black finds the right follow-up. So specifically, like after knight c5 here, black has to find this very strong idea to push a4. So sacrificing a pawn, knight takes a4, but then playing knight d7. The idea being that now white's knight on c5 is no longer hitting e6, so black can play knight d7 and either take this pawn or basically get the knight into the game. The rook is going to be hitting a2 one day, and then basically this pawn on c3 is way too strong. Much stronger than whatever white can hope to achieve on the king's side. My play here is just way too slow. So yeah, this line was just like good for black, but it's kind of hard to go for this when you're up a piece, because you're like giving back the piece and you don't know how good that endgame is going to be. But apparently black is just like winning. It's like not even close. Instead, my opponent played c5, which kind of reminiscent of the Kramnik-Anand game, because he's just like blasting the center open. I took a little bit of time here to play knight d6. I just didn't see another move, because it looks like, okay, I shut down the queen, I kind of shut down black's position, I hit the b5 pawn with check. You know, there's not much else you could ask for with a move. And then he played bishop d7. This is actually maybe the moment where he missed a chance for an advantage again with this move, knight c6. This is apparently very strong. Just developing and just trying to collapse white center. I can take on b5 with check, but after king b6, it turns out white doesn't really have much of a follow-up here. And I think the engine is just saying that black is winning, like up a piece, and white's center is collapsing. King is not that unsafe on b6, and yeah, white's bishop is now not particularly impressive, and yeah, white kind of runs out of compensation here very quickly. But knight c6 is kind of a hard move to find, and it's very hard to play when you have, like, I think at this point maybe 10 minutes on your clock, maybe less, maybe like 8 minutes. So this is really where the time that black burned earlier on would have been extremely useful. Because he ends up going bishop d7, which is a reasonable move, but a little bit passive. I took on c4. So now I have 2 pawns for the piece. And it looks very dangerous for black. I mean, the pawns are all threatening to get traded. The files are opening up. I have rook fc1 coming. And again, he can't take because rook takes f1, rook to f7 is coming, and that's going to be really annoying. And here he played queen g5, which actually ends up being a pretty serious mistake. What he should have done was just shut down the position with b4. And if I take on c5 here, he can go bishop takes e5. And this basically should be good for black. I'm not sure what else I can do. I do have some moves like knight f7, like I was considering this, queen to e7 and d5. I really wasn't sure what to make of this. It looked very dangerous. I think the engine was saying black can just take and go bishop takes e5, and apparently black is everything is working out, like knight e5, take with check, queen takes e5, and looks like white isn't really getting enough for the piece anymore. So b4 I think was a good move, maybe the last chance for black to pick up an advantage here. He goes queen to g5. And the problem is that after queen takes g5, hg, and c takes b5, his king is still kind of weak, and I've now grabbed a third pawn. So material-wise, white is now picking up a lot of material. And this construction with knight on d6, pawn on b5 is actually really annoying for black's pieces. Like the bishop is restricted, the knight is restricted, and the rook is also restricted. So it's actually still hard for black to get the pieces out. I have ideas of playing like bishop f3, and the rook is actually hanging in a lot of lines. Okay, so here Andrew finally takes on f1, and this turns out to be a mistake. So he basically couldn't hold on longer. He finally makes this trade. I think the reason was the other move to consider was c takes d4, and I think he was worried about either rook fc1 here or maybe bishop f3, and then he wouldn't get a chance to trade the rook anymore. So that's why he decided to trade rooks first. My idea was to go rook fc1, but apparently after king d8, white doesn't have a huge follow-up here. I think it was supposed to be about equal, but it's basically just a mess. But white would be better after bishop f3. With the idea that rook a7 is forced, white pushes b6, takes rook a b1, and now the pieces just kind of start flooding in. Check, I win back a piece by force, takes, and then like rook c5 the engine was giving, and apparently white is better in this position. Looks like I'm up a pawn, knight and bishop are both good, and yeah, black's position looks kind of passive. Definitely not over, but looks like white is better. Hey, Ponspute, thanks for subscribing, much appreciated. Okay, objectively that was still the better way to go, and I'm not sure I would have played bishop f3. I think I was really kind of focused on rook fc1 check, but in any case he took on f1, rook takes f1, c takes d4, and here the problem is just the immediate rook f7, and this turns out to be actually really bad for black. I mean, I'm still down a piece, but bishop f3 is coming, and the real issue is he can't take on e5. After bishop takes e5, I think he kind of didn't realize this in time. I play knight c4. Bishop doesn't have any good squares. If bishop d6, white has b6 check, and if the king wants to stay in contact with the bishop, runs into bishop f3, and white is just winning back all of the material with interest. Okay, could also move the rook here, but it should still be good for white. I think in this position we can also consider taking on a8. And so since bishop d6 is not possible, black has to go back like bishop h8. But then white can go b6 check again, and if the king steps on this diagonal, it's just bishop f3, and there's no knight c6 because of rook takes d7. And if the king goes to d8, then I can just play rook f8 and take the bishop, and my b pawn is still super strong. The rook is still incredibly awkward. Bishop is coming back to f3, and yeah, this will be a annoying pin to deal with on the back rank. So yeah, I think he kind of overlooked this, and then after rook f7, if black can't take on e5, then the position is really bad. I think he pretty much used up the rest of his time here and played bishop h6, and at this point I think he was down to like a minute to make 15 more moves. It's not impossible because he does have the 30-second increment, but his position is very difficult. And actually this ended up really not working out so great for black. Okay, so I played bishop f3, rook a7, and knight c4. To me, this just looked like what I have to do because I'm actually trapping the rook here. Like black goes king d8, b6, rook a6, bishop b7. This is all kind of forced. And then white is winning the exchange. I'm going to get rook versus two bishops, but with a couple of extra pawns. And in particular, this pawn on b6 is pretty strong. So I thought this was just winning. Engine proved me wrong afterwards. It turns out I should have instead gone for like rook h7, just left the rook on a7 alone, bishop f8, and then rook h8 is actually winning, because if bishop takes d6, I take on d6 with a check, and the knight is lost. And if bishop g7, I go rook to g8, let's say bishop h6, and I think there's a number of winning moves for white here, but the fanciest one by far is a4, and this is a move I would have loved to play, because I'm securing the pawn on b5, and like 3 of black's pieces are just completely trapped. Actually, the king also doesn't really have any moves because the knight on b8 is hanging. So this would have been just like a beautiful zugzwang to kind of play into. But yeah, I'm kind of a simple guy. I just went for the material. And yeah, so after bishop b7, he ends up playing g4, which I can understand. He just needed to open up this dark squared bishop and try to get something going with his d pawn. I was really expecting bishop b5, which is actually just the only move black can play. But actually this position after bishop takes a6 and bishop takes a6 is actually not that clear. I mean, during the game I thought it was like winning for white, because I can play knight d2 and maybe knight b3 and this pawn is under control. Or yeah, I can even take here and then drop back with knight d2, and this pawn is fine. I have so many pawns. B pawn looks really strong. I can play h4 whenever I want and create passers on the king side. So I mean, this is like dream scenario, you know, rook versus 2 minor pieces. When your rook is super active, enemy king is cut off, you have pass pawns on both sides of the board. But the problem is, like, after knight d7, I just didn't realize, like, I'm actually losing my pawn. I'm just taking on b6, or maybe taking on e5. In fact, my pawn is not that strong. It's not promoting. It's under control. And once black takes on b6 here, basically black is fine. Like, white isn't going to have a strong pass pawn, and the knight is going to get back into the game, and yeah, it's going to be very hard for me to create counterplay. If anything, it's actually, I was analyzing, it's white who has to be careful not to fall worse. So this was very weird to me. I mean, I was really surprised that this, I just thought it was kind of over, but yeah, it shows how deep the game is and how little we can see and how much we can underestimate during the game. So he ended up playing g4, but you know, I think this is where the time trouble really kind of hurt black here, because I think even if he had like 3 or 4 minutes here, he would have played bishop b5. But because he was playing on the increment, like 30 seconds or maybe a minute he had, it's just not enough time to play well consistently, and so he played reasonably well up to this point, but at some point you're just gonna collapse. You know, it's just a fact of nature. So g4, bishop takes a6, knight takes a6, rook h7. Now this is just winning for white because his pieces aren't getting the same activity. The knight on a6 is actually a really bad piece, because in the previous position it was the bishop that was blockading and the knight that was kind of attacking the pawn. Here the knight is going to be responsible for defending against the pawn, but that means that the knight is going to be very passive, and yeah, basically concretely white is just doing very well here. He played bishop f8, because otherwise I would be getting rook h8 check and rook a8, which would be a big problem for black. Rook h8, king e7, and here I basically calculated a nice line here, knowing that since my opponent is in time trouble, he isn't going to be able to put up a lot of resistance. So I went for a pretty forcing position that I think is just good for white. So I play rook h4. Black has no way of defending the g4 pawn, so he goes bishop b5. This is kind of the only active move he has in the position. So I was like expecting this one. I played knight to d6 pretty quickly. Now the bishop is hanging, the pawn on g4 is hanging, so he goes bishop to e2. Like, what else are you really going to come up with 30 seconds? King to f2 and d3. Again, what other move are you really going to play here with 30 seconds on your clock? And this is kind of the position I was aiming for, because after rook h7 check, black is just kind of completely stuck here. The bishop on e2, it looks pretty solid, but the problem is black is never able to push d2 because the bishop is just hanging. Hey, Flying Sheep, thanks so much for checking out the stream, and yeah, have a good night. I'll see you next week, where I'll be streaming the analysis of the rest of these games. So the game is basically over here. Black played king d8, rook a7. Knight had to go back to b8, otherwise the pawn can just promote. Rook a8, bishop takes d6 forced, e takes d6, king to c8. And now white has a couple of wins here. I think d7 is easily winning as well, but I think what I did is much simpler. Just rook takes b8, king takes d7. Kind of a nice finish. The king is cut off, the bishop is cut off, and white ends up down a piece, you know, like the piece we sacrificed, but ends up promoting the d-pawn in the end. d2, king takes e2, and that was the end of the game. So yeah, I mean, it was definitely felt good to get one back, but after analyzing the game, I felt like I really got away with one here. I mean, I was just like, the sacrifice I think was quite dubious. It was interesting, but objectively I think white has a tougher time there, and had my opponent played better at various points, then the result would very much have been in doubt. And I think at a couple of points I was just clearly worse or losing, and then even at the end, had black found this bishop b5 move in the endgame, black would have been not worse here. In fact, maybe just pushing for the win. So yeah, I definitely felt lucky to get this one back, but I was happy after losing the previous game to come back in the tournament. It's always a question of whether you're even going to win one game in these events, because the field is so tough. But yeah.